Hello, and thank you for joining my presentation over folklore variation in video games. Today I will be showing a demo of a video game that I'm working on that showcases folklore variation and how it can be applicable to games in that kind of sense. So I came up with the idea for this project because for my senior capstone, I decided I wanted to do something with folklore variation since it's something that I find very interesting about folklore. And I have noticed a pattern where people tend to put value over stories that have one identity. The fans tend to cling very tightly to the canonicity of the story, and if anything is kind of like set in that universe but isn't necessarily deemed canon, then it's kind of viewed as lesser. For example, like Star Wars fans aren't nearly as highly regarding of the Star Wars books than they are the Star Wars movies. Since those have been deemed not canon, therefore they aren't really worth the time, despite still being stories in their own right. And in terms of folk tales, I've noticed this idea of kind of saying the original folk tales are have a kind of prestige about them. It's like, oh, Disney watered them down. They're not as dark as they used to be, which is true because they have changed over time. And I want to kind of encourage this idea that all of these stories are existing together at once. None of them hold a certain power over the others simply because they're older or they're different in a certain way. They are all their own stories that are all the same story as well. And something I thought would be a good method for showing this is video games, because there are several video games that are built around this premise of having multiple endings. And sometimes those games will have one ending that is labeled as the true ending, though they're not quite as common as the games that have have all these endings, and it's simply what the player finds is what the player gets, and the player can go back and go through so many different endings and so many different versions of this story of the video game, and none of them are seen as lesser. They're all just seen as different versions of the same story, much like how variations in folktale are just different versions of the same story that are all equally valid. So I decided to use a video game that makes choices that take you down different story paths with a folktale to kind of exemplify this idea. I chose to do this over the folktale Hansel and Gretel, or more generally, the tale type 327 as defined by Professor D.L. Ashliman. And I used his database to gather some variations of that tale type and of the Hansel and Gretel tale, and then narrowed them down to create a workable amount. I decided to stick with the ones that were broadly recognized as Hansel and Gretel tales, and kind of set aside the ones that took different paths. I chose all of them where the children get lost in the woods, they find a witch, the witch tries to cook them, the children escape. I didn't decide to go with any that involved more trickery or involved like more travel or things like that, simply because I am doing this in a limited amount of time, and that would, while being very interesting, would take up a lot more time, and more than I have. So ultimately the tales that I chose were that of Grimm's Hansel and Gretel from Germany, of course, uh, the Jan and Hannah tale from Poland, Old Gruel from Moravia, and Johnny and Grizzle by Jacobs from England. And I figured that these would be they're all similar enough yet different enough that this is a good proof of concept for this idea of folktale variation via video game form. And so now I would like to take you on a short demo of the game that I have so far to show this idea in action. Give me one moment. So this is currently the beginning of my video game. I'll play it over a couple of times to kind of get the idea of the branching paths. So of course, we start with Once Upon a Time. And then we go into the first of all of the choices, which are, do the children live with their father and their mother, or do they live with their father and their stepmother? Because there are a few variations in which the children do live with their biological mother, and there are a few that kind of reinforce the wicked stepmother archetype. So let's start down this wicked stepmother path. And I'm presenting this game in kind of a graphic novel form, specifically with panels and captions to visually tell the story. So we have here the wicked stepmother who resents caring for children that are not her own. And we see the wicked stepmother sending them to their room. And here we have another choice in which the children either go to their room or they hide underneath a table to tell their father what their stepmother has done to them. Now this is the end of what I have programmed for this specific stepmother path. The path in which they go to their room results in them not knowing that their father is going to take them into the woods. And so that is the version in which the father leads a trail through the woods to lead them back home. And then the other one in which they had on the table, the children do know about being abandoned in the woods. So that is the version in which the young boy takes pebbles and then breadcrumbs to leave the trail himself. So now we can explore a different path. Once again, starting with Once Upon a Time. This time, we'll go down the mother path. So we have two children that live with their mother. In this one, I decided to better emphasize that the family was poor and don't have enough food, since the version in which they do have a biological mother that is with them instead of a wicked stepmother. It is more, that is more so important because in the wicked stepmother stories, the kind of driving factor of the children being left in the woods is the wicked stepmother as a villain rather than the family's poverty as a driving force. And here we have the children begging for food as a thunderstorm rolls in. But since the family has no food, they get sent to bed. And then we have we have 3 choices here of the children staying awake and going to bed and staying awake, going to bed and going to sleep, and sneaking out to catch berries. The one in which they sneak out is why I included the bit about the thunderstorm, as that is in line with the old rule tale in which they're not abandoned in the woods, they actually just get lost after disobeying their parents. And then the other one, much like the wicked stepmother path, there is a path in which the children hear their parents and know of their plot, and a path in which the children don't know that they're going to be abandoned in the woods. So here they're staying awake, here they're going to get berries, and here they're going to sleep. Let's go down the path of staying awake and finding out that their parents plan on leaving them in the woods. So here they hear their parents arguing. They go to the door to listen. And here we have the farthest on choice in this first page that I have coded into the game, in which either their mother wants to send them away or their father wants to send them away. This one wasn't super integral to the story, but there are different versions in which the mother or the father want to send them away. And I wanted to include both of those since I find that like even small variations can sometimes get people worked up about the idea of what is true to a story. And so I wanted to include something like that in which it doesn't have any broad sweeping strokes, but just little ideas where it's not to, like either way, the parents are going to send them away, but whether the mother or the father has a different connotation, as I made the mother anxious because she doesn't want to see her children die slowly in front of her, while the father is a bit angrier because in those stories he's kind of telling the mom that he is doing this and there's not really a choice, while the stories in which the mom suggests they're taken away, she kind of has to convince the dad to do it a little bit, and she's portrayed as a little bit crueler in those ones, though I decided for characterization purposes to make her more worried, since there's already the wicked stepmother character who acts as kind of that role. And so that is the demo that I have so far. There is obviously much more still left to do. I intend on having all of the paths so far in the beginning kind of come back together when the children find the house in the woods made of candy. Because like I said, I wanted a lot of similar stories. So there's a lot of different way that the children get there, but in all of the tales that I chose, they all do find a candy house. So rather than everything kind of branching out into very different paths, they all kind of branch out, come together, and then branch out again. And so I have a rough script of all of the choices. There will be various ones in which It changes whether both of the children are locked up by the witch or if just the boy is locked up and the girl is left to do chores. There are slightly different ways that the children trick the witch. The little girl telling the witch that she doesn't know how to check the oven and then she just pushes her in. The children sitting on the bread pusher, but they act like they can't and they convince the witch to show them how and then they push her in via the bread pusher. And the choices at the beginning of the game will affect the exact ending when the children return home, whether they come back to find that their wicked stepmother has died or that their family has now gotten some money so that they don't have to worry about food anymore, or if the children found some money in the gingerbread house. But they all end with the happy ending. And that is the game that I am working on. It is small and it's just a proof of concept for this idea. There's not a lot of variation. I would love, given more time and resources, to do a game that further explores more abandoned children in the woods stories, or maybe like other fairy tales. I briefly considered Snow White, that had so many other different branching types of story. But ultimately, I have a time constraint. I have to limit it to what I can do in a few months. But I do believe that this game and this idea is a good way of exemplifying folktale variation in such a way that it can be easily understood by modern audiences. It's often hard for people to wrap their head around the idea that every version of Cinderella is correct. Every fairy tale that is told isn't just a different version of the one true version. They're all their own thing and they all serve their own purpose and all contribute to the story as a whole. So much like folklorists know this, I think this is a good way of showing to other people that aren't studied in folklore that every different branching version of this story contributes to the story as a whole, and all of them serve their own function. All of them, while telling different stories, still ultimately will tell the same one in whatever way is needed or wanted by the person telling it. And so thank you so much for seeing my presentation. An important note is that while the writing and the drawing and a small part of the coding was done by me, I need to give credit for a majority of the coding to my good friend Ian Roseborough, who has been so kind as to give me their time and their effort to help me move this project along and to use their much more capable computer for both the coding and this demo. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great conference.